Good morning. We have a few goals. One is to appreciate the long, great history, civilization of the Russian people, one of the world's greatest civilizations, and not to demonize them, the people, but to try to understand their past. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, President Kennedy gave, I think, his greatest speech at the American University commencement on June 10, 1963, and at the height of the Cold War, after the near miss of a nuclear war 6 months earlier, he said, we can't demonize the Soviet people. We have to try to find some common basis to understand them and some common ground, at least on a people-to-people basis, so that we might avert the worst. And I really congratulate Sarah and Bruce and the organizers for giving us insights into Russian culture and history that are so important. And that's what, in part, that national anthem represents. So this morning, we have a long day ahead of us. I thought that Matt Rozhansky also gave us very good insights into the thinking of the Russian leadership last night. He kind of took us into the heads of the Russian leadership. And the other goal of this conference is to begin to delve into the other side of this relationship, the crisis between Russia and the West, the crisis between Russia and the United States. And my goal this morning is to try to take you into the minds of the American leadership in Washington, D.C., because we have to see both sides of this story. I am no longer in that government, but I think I have a sense of how the president and his advisors might see this story. And so we've been focused on this country for a very long time. The Americans are now talking about pivoting to Asia because the relationship with China is so important. The burning Middle East is engulfing American foreign policy, but this country still is a major priority, and Matt talked about the reason why last night. Our two countries have the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. If we're not smart, if we don't try very hard to avert crisis between us, the worst could happen. And so Russia is always going to be important. But this year, I think this past year, has been the worst year in U.S.-Russian relations, Europe's relations with the Russian government since the end of the Cold War 25 years ago. What produced the crisis in 2014? Well, certainly this, and forgive the spelling mistake, it should be M-A-I-D-A-N, but the struggle of millions of Ukrainians against the autocratic rule of President Yanukovych. He fled Kiev 1 year ago today. And this crisis produced in the minds of President Putin, as Matt described last night, I think the Russian government saw it as a plot by Ukrainian nationalists and their supporters in the West to overthrow President Yanukovych. It was seen very differently in Washington. It was seen as a people's revolt against autocracy for some kind of democratic future. That led very quickly to the invasion of Crimea by President Putin and the annexation of Crimea by President Putin. Ukraine is a sovereign nation in the United Nations. It has a right to have its borders protected. Those borders were violently offended by the Russian government, and the annexation of Crimea, we haven't seen this kind of dismemberment of another country since the fascist governments of World War II. And then, of course, the downing of the Malaysian airliner in July. It is very likely that the SA-11 missile system that brought down that airliner that killed 298 people was given to the Russian separatist rebels by the Russian military and by the Russian government. This turned the tide in thinking not only in the government in Washington, but also in the European governments, particularly in Germany. It led to sanctions by the European Union and the United States against Russia. It led then an attempt in September, the Minsk Agreement, to try to impose a ceasefire, to try to work out a resolution of some of the differences between the rebels and the Ukrainian government. But that Minsk Agreement was then repudiated by the Russian government and the Russian rebels. Further loss of confidence by Chancellor Merkel and the Europeans in Russia. And of course, we've seen in the last 4 or 5 months an open assist from the Russian government, thousands of Russian troops across the border, Russian missile systems, Russian tanks, including, by the way, over the last 48 hours, into Ukraine to turn the tide of the civil war against the Ukrainian government in favor of the rebels. That is my highly subjective, but I think very accurate view of how Washington sees this crisis over the last year, and it has produced a division of Ukraine that Steve Pfeiffer will talk about in his presentation early this afternoon. What does Putin want? If you ask an American, if you ask people in our government, if you ask me, it's to build a band of buffer states to the south and west of Russia to insulate Russia from the West. This has been a frozen conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan since the early 1990s, really a leftover from the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the Russian government not having an interest in resolving this problem. Of course, as Matt said last night, Russia invaded Georgia, a sovereign nation, in August of 2008. Russia has supported the bogus sovereignty claims of separatist elements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Moldova, a sovereign nation state, has a frozen conflict called Transnistria, where Russia has been openly supporting and consolidating the activities of people who don't want to see Moldova fully sovereign. And of course, the Ukraine crisis and the annexation of Crimea. To the south and west of Russia, and look at Ukraine there in the west, Putin, looking backwards in a 19th or 20th century way, my gain is your loss is my gain, zero-sum politics. He's going to make sure these countries are off balance. They're divided internally. He assists the divisions to keep them weak and to keep them dependent on Russia and to prevent them from being truly independent. I think Washington would say, this is what Putin wants. This is a violation of the UN Charter, to invade a sovereign country, to annex it, to grab part of its territory. How has the West reacted? And these are the two primary actors. And I said last night that Chancellor Merkel, in a way, is probably the most important conduit to Putin because she speaks Russian. He speaks German. And Germany is so important to Russia from an economic standpoint. She's been the leader in most of the talks. It's a reversal from how Americans have generally led in these conflicts in decades past. They made an important decision very early on that NATO would not fight Putin for the future of Ukraine. We have no historical or legal or ethical obligation to defend Ukraine. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. And so from the first days of this crisis, 1 year ago, they made it very clear to Putin, we're not going to engage in a war with you for the future of Ukraine, but we are in a chess match with you. And so we're going to use the only instruments we have available, which is economic sanctions. They've been highly imperfect. They haven't really made a dent, I think, in Putin's thinking because they've been so modest. But as I said, that shoot-down triggered stronger sanctions. And now we have another ceasefire negotiated by Merkel and French President François Hollande with Putin just 2 weeks ago, which is now unraveling. And the Ukrainian government said that they think there are massive violations. President Hollande said yesterday, massive violations by the Russian authorities. Should this ceasefire completely unravel, the probability of that is very high. Then I think we're going to see much stronger economic sanctions by the Americans, by the Europeans, and I believe the American government should turn to provide lethal military assistance to the Ukrainian government to do two things. Help them defend themselves, their sovereign territory, against the Russian military and the Russian pro-Russia separatists, and to level the playing field and drive up the cost to President Putin of what he's doing. And Steve has been involved in an effort of people outside the government to make the argument for that projection of lethal force. What are the consequences for us, for the Americans, the Canadians, the Europeans, the members of NATO? Here's the most important. I served in the White House when the Soviet Union fell. I was a Soviet advisor to President George H.W. Bush at the time. We were overjoyed because the Cold War had ended. All those dividing lines between East and West, Warsaw Pact and NATO, Berlin divided, Germany divided, they were all erased between 1989 and 1991. Putin is drawing new lines in Europe. He's drawing lines. He's telling the Armenians, he's telling the Moldovans, he's telling the Ukrainians, you can't even have trade agreements with the European Union. You can't have a normal relationship with Europe because I want you to be in my orbit. Those are the stakes. It runs counter to what we think we had achieved at the end of the Cold War. Finally, a Europe that was whole, free, and at peace, that was democratic, everything that was not when we fought with Europe in the First and Second World Wars. We still have vital interests in Europe. Our largest military alliance in the world is NATO. 26 European countries with Canada and the United States. Our largest trade partner, Europe. Our largest investor into our economy, Europe. And so what happens in this continent is profoundly important, and I would, with the greatest respect, dispute something that Matt said yesterday, but I think he might have just been channeling how you perceive how the Russians view us. The United States is a European power. We have been since the close of the Second World War. We're the strongest military force on that continent. We are bound to the Europeans by the NATO treaty. And so we have an obligation to help Europe sort this out. So President Obama and Chancellor Merkel cannot allow Putin to redivide Europe. Now here's the rub. And here's the dilemma, and it makes diplomacy so difficult and so fascinating. We need to contain the Russian government and protect our NATO allies on the one hand, but as we talked about last night, we really do need Russia on the Iran nuclear talks, on Afghanistan, on counterterrorism, on the fight against drugs. So how do you create strategic deterrence if you're Merkel and Obama, keep Putin away from the NATO countries, and yet try to have some basis to work with the Russian government on those very important priorities that we had? Where might Putin strike next? The great concern is, if you don't stand up to him through sanctions, through helping the Ukrainian government in eastern Ukraine, will he then become emboldened to try to destabilize these two countries? I know them very well. I've been there many times. I helped to negotiate, when I was ambassador to NATO, their entry into NATO. These states were occupied by the Red Army, by Stalin, in May 1940. They were obliterated and subsumed into the Soviet Union. Their leadership was sent into exile, and most of them were murdered by Stalin in the 1940s. They arose as nation states, and we took them back into NATO in 2004. Both of them have a high percentage of ethnic Russians living in their countries. In Estonia, about a quarter, slightly more in Latvia. And so the fear is that President Putin might try to incite a rebellion of the ethnic Russian populations, turbulence, domestic strife, in order to destabilize these governments. We have a solemn obligation to these governments through the NATO Treaty, Article 5. If any one of us is attacked, all of us will respond. And so President Obama has made it very clear publicly, and I hope privately, to President Putin, if you seek to destabilize Estonia and Latvia, we, the United States, we, the Germans, we, the French, we, the British, we, the Poles, will have to defend them. So this is what strategic deterrence is. Telling President Putin, you may want to destabilize Ukraine, you cannot destabilize our NATO allies. Last point. There are a lot of people who think, even some Americans, my friend Tom Friedman has been saying this for a generation, that we caused the crisis. That by expanding NATO and the European Union up to the Russian borders, we somehow made Putin into the aggressor he is. This is NATO in 1990, a newly unified Germany in the center that came into NATO. We took in 3 new countries in 1999. And then we took in 7 new countries, and I was ambassador to NATO at this time. Very proud that we did this. And then in 2009, 2 more. We've added 12 countries to NATO. Why did we do that? Was that a provocation to the Russian government? We helped 109 million people achieve a future of freedom. We embedded them in the European Union, which also expanded into these countries, in NATO, so they could live freely, establish democratic governments, and be free from future aggression from the Russian government. That's why we expanded NATO. It was demand-driven. These people said to us, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Estonians, and Latvians, please let us join the Western Alliance. We want to have capitalistic economies. We want to have free democratic systems. We don't want to live under the sway of a Russian dictatorship. And President George H.W. Bush and President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama have all agreed this is the American national interest, because we did fear, even in President Yeltsin's time, the return of an aggressive nationalist government. We did know that when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, there was a vacuum of power in Central Europe, and if we didn't fill it, you can bet that a future nationalist government would have. If these countries weren't in NATO and the European Union right now, do you think that President Putin would be laying off and not intimidating them and not trying to expand Russian power right into the heart of Central Europe? I think it's one of the most important strategic advances the United States has made in a generation with Europe to expand into these countries. Where is the crisis headed? These two gentlemen and Chancellor Merkel will be the primary actors in the crisis. Are we headed to a new Cold War? I would say no. A lot of us remember the Cold War, a complete ideological, physical separation. We're going to talk about Samantha Smith later of Manchester, Maine. What she did was basically pierce the fact that she was able to connect to the Russian people and pierce the screen that kept us from even meeting the Russian people. That was a complete separation. We're still connected to the Russian people. We still trade with Russia. Not a new Cold War. I think there won't be a military conflict because President Putin understands the United States and NATO are far, far stronger than the Russian military. It would be suicidal. But are we coming back to what President Kennedy warned about in his inaugural address of January 1961? Another long twilight struggle, a power struggle in Europe. I would say the chances of another generation of struggle for power between Russia and the West, it's upon us. And I hope the United States and Europe prevail because I believe in democracy and freedom. Thank you very much.